Picture this. You are standing in an open grave. A priest towers over you, shovel in hand. He isn't burying a corpse, he is burying you. He throws dirt into your face and recites the Mass of Separation. You are dead to the world, he chants, and alive only to God. This was the brutal legal reality for lepers in the 12th century. A mandatory living funeral. But in 1174, one boy cheated this ritual. Instead of a grave, they gave him a kingdom. Instead of a wooden clapper to warn people away, they gave him a sword. This is the story of King Baldwin IV, the Leper King who defied biology, logic, and the most powerful army in the East. But before he could fight Saladin, he had to fight the silence of his own body. The nightmare didn't begin on a battlefield. It began in a playground. The year is 1170. A group of young noble boys in Jerusalem are playing a rough game, digging their sharp fingernails into each other's arms to see who cries out first. It's a test of toughness. Boys scream. They pull away. They rub their bruised skin. But William of Tyre, the royal tutor, notices one boy who isn't reacting. Prince Baldwin. He is 9 years old. He isn't crying. He isn't even flinching. He is laughing, thinking he is winning the game. William steps in. He grabs the prince's right arm and drives his fingernails deep into the flesh, harder than any playmate would dare. The skin turns white, then red. But the boy just looks at him, confused. "I feel nothing," Baldwin says. That sentence was a catastrophe. William immediately recognized the symptoms. Lepra. The sensation in the boy's right arm and hand was already gone. In the brutal world of the Middle Ages, this diagnosis was usually a one-way ticket to social exile. But Baldwin was the heir to the throne. The High Court made a terrifying choice. They would hide the diagnosis. They would pretend the boy was fine. 4 years later, King Amalric dies. Baldwin is 13. He is crowned King of Jerusalem. But as the heavy gold crown settles on his head, the court is already plotting his replacement. The nobles look at him and see a placeholder king. They know leprosy is a death sentence. They expect him to rot away while they carve up the kingdom. They assume a boy who cannot feel his own hand cannot possibly hold a sword. They are dead wrong. Baldwin refuses to hide. He refuses to retire. He begins a brutal regimen of physical training. If he cannot feel the reins of a horse with his hands, he will learn to steer with his knees. If he cannot grip a sword with strength, he will lock it to his arm. He forces his decaying body to obey his iron will. We have to understand what this means. Riding a warhorse in the 12th century requires immense strength in the hands to control 1,000 pounds of muscle and armored fury. Baldwin was losing sensation in his hands. His grip was failing. So he adapted. He learned to ride almost entirely with his knees, training his legs to become vices of iron. When his hands could no longer hold the sword securely, he had his squires bind the hilt to his gauntlet, tying the steel to his flesh so he literally could not drop it. He turned his own body into a rigid extension of his military equipment. And he has no time to waste. Because rising from Egypt is a threat that will not wait for the boy to grow up. Saladin has united the Saracen forces. He smells blood. He knows Jerusalem is led by a sick child. He prepares to strike, convinced the conquest will be easy. He is about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is a man who has nothing left to lose. November 1177. Saladin crosses the border from Egypt with an army of 26,000 men. It is a force so large the ground literally trembles under their hoofs. Baldwin manages to scrape together 500 knights. He rides south to the fortress city of Ascalon with every available man. When Saladin sees Baldwin hide inside Ascalon's walls, he smiles. The Leper King is afraid. The boy has hidden behind stone walls to die safely. Saladin makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He ignores Baldwin. He marches his massive army past Ascalon, heading straight for Jerusalem. The holy city is undefended. Believing there is no army left to stop him, Saladin allows his tight military formation to break apart. His soldiers scatter across the countryside to pillage, their weapons packed away, their armor unbuckled in the heat. Inside Ascalon, Baldwin watches the smoke rising. He realizes Jerusalem is hours from destruction. He has a choice: stay safe behind walls and watch his kingdom burn, or leave with a few hundred knights into the open desert against thousands. It is suicide. But Baldwin is a man who has lived with death since he was 9 years old. Death does not scare him. Dishonor does. He orders the gates to open. 500 heavy cavalry ride north, shadowing Saladin's sprawling, disorganized army. They move hidden by dunes and the glare of the sun. It is a ghost march. The pain for Baldwin during this ride is unimaginable. The friction of the saddle on his numb, Ulcerated skin would be causing damage he couldn't even feel until he looked down and saw blood. But his mind is sharp. On November 25th, they crest a hill. Below them lies Saladin's army, completely unaware. They are washing in streams. They are feeding horses. They are resting. Before the charge, something happens that transcends military history. The Bishop of Bethlehem steps forward carrying the true cross, the relic believed to be the very timber upon which Christ died. Baldwin struggles down from his horse. He falls to his knees in the sand. And in front of his hardened knights, the king begins to weep. He doesn't pray for victory. He prays that the kingdom not fall because of his own sins, his own sickness. It is raw, naked vulnerability. The knights watch their broken king crying in the dust, and something shifts. They are no longer fighting for land. They are fighting for him. When Baldwin stands up, the tears are gone. He is helped back onto his horse. He points his bandaged hand toward the sea of enemies below. The 500 knights lower their visors. The 500 lances drop into position. They are a steel wedge aimed at the throat of the unsuspecting giant. When Baldwin's knights hit the disorganized Saracen lines, the sound was reportedly deafening, the crunch of metal, the shattering of wood, the screams of men caught completely unaware. The element of surprise was absolute. The Crusaders didn't give them a second. They smashed through the baggage train and drove straight into the heart of the enemy. At the center of this storm rode King Baldwin IV. To the Muslim soldiers this was a ghost. This was the boy their sultan had dismissed as a corpse. And yet here he was, riding out of the sunset like an avenging angel. Panic spread like wildfire. The leper is here. The leper is here. The numerical advantage of 26,000 men evaporated instantly. Saladin's army dissolved into chaotic stampede. In the middle of the slaughter, Saladin's personal bodyguards fought to buy him time. They formed a ring of steel and were slaughtered to the last man so their sultan could run. Saladin fled into the desert night on a racing camel, abandoning his army, his baggage, and his pride. By the time he reached safety in Egypt, only a handful of followers were still with him. The Battle of Montgisard wasn't just a victory, it was an annihilation. A 16-year-old boy with a rotting body had destroyed the most powerful army in the known world. Baldwin returned to Jerusalem a hero. Bells rang. People knelt in the streets, some believing his leprosy was a sign of divine favor, that he was suffering like Christ so they could be saved. But as the armor was peeled off in his chambers, the truth was horrifying. The lesions had spread. The numbness had crept further. He had traded months of his life for one day of victory. Saladin, humiliated and furious, learned a lesson he would never forget. He famously said, "God does not want the Christians to lose this land while this king is alive." But Baldwin's greatest victory was also the beginning of his end. The clock was ticking faster now. By his late teens, the disease had begun to dismantle his face. The cartilage of his nose dissolved. His lips retracted, exposing teeth in a permanent, skull-like grin. He covered his face with heavy silk veils to spare his subjects the horror. But the visual horror was secondary to the sensory deprivation. Baldwin was slowly going blind. He couldn't blink. His eyes remained permanently open, drying out and turning opaque. And then there was the smell. As the flesh on his extremities died, gangrene set in. The king of Jerusalem rotted while he sat on his throne. Yet in this darkness, his mind burned brighter than ever. As his body failed, his will hardened. When he could no longer hold a pen, he had stamps made. When he could no longer walk, he was carried in a litter. He became a voice in the dark, governing a kingdom on the brink of apocalypse. But a king needs an heir. Baldwin was sterile. The future rested on his sister Sibylla. Baldwin needed a strong brother-in-law to replace his own useless arm. Enter Guy de Lusignan, a French knight with striking good looks but very little military intelligence. Sibylla fell in love with him. Against the advice of his wisest lords, Baldwin consented to the marriage. It was a decision made out of desperation. It was wrong. In 1183, Baldwin formally handed the regency to Guy. This was the moment everyone had waited for. Finally, a healthy man in charge. Saladin crossed the Jordan River, burning villages. Guy mustered the largest crusader army ever assembled. He had the position. He had the troops to crush Saladin. The armies met at the pools of Goliath. The crusaders held high ground. The knights waited for the order to charge. They waited. And they waited. Guy de Lusignan froze. He refused to give the order. He stood paralyzed while Saladin's army maneuvered and eventually simply packed up and left. It was a military disgrace. When the news reached the blind, bedridden king, the corpse woke up. Baldwin's fury was absolute. He summoned the high court and stripped Guy of the regency. He turned to his nephew, Sibylla's son, a 5-year-old also named Baldwin. The coronation of little Baldwin IV was heartbreaking. King Baldwin IV was too weak to stand. He was carried in on a litter. The child was too small to be seen, so a knight lifted him onto his shoulders for the entire ceremony, while the dying king lay on a stretcher in the shadows. It was a desperate, final gamble. In late 1183, Saladin surrounded the fortress of Carrick during a royal wedding. The garrison was starving, trapped. They sent desperate messengers to Jerusalem. Baldwin ordered his servants to prepare him for travel. He could not sit a horse. He could not even sit upright. So he ordered a litter constructed, a stretcher carried between horses. The army of Jerusalem marched out, thousands of knights in glittering mail. And in the center was no king on a white stallion, just a box with curtains swaying gently. Inside lay a blind, decaying man, his mind projecting a force of will that held the entire army together. When Saladin's scouts reported the king's litter approaching, Saladin knew what it meant. Upon hearing that Baldwin was personally commanding the relief force, Saladin ordered a retreat. He had the superior position. He had the numbers. But he knew the Crusader army was unbreakable when the Leper King was with them. Saladin lifted the siege. Baldwin was carried into Carrick as a savior. But this was his final act. He had used the last ounce of his vitality. The journey back to Jerusalem was a funeral procession for a living man. The end and the fall. Spring 1185. Baldwin IV is 24 years old. He has reigned for 11 years longer than any doctor predicted. On March 16, 1185, the Leper King took his final breath. For Baldwin, death was not tragedy, it was mercy. It was the first moment in nearly 2 decades that he was not in pain. He was buried near Golgotha, a king who suffered in his flesh, buried near where Christ was believed to have suffered on the cross. According to Baldwin's will, the crown passed to little Baldwin V. But in summer 1186, just 1 year later, the child king died at age 9. Sibylla was crowned queen. The barons made her swear to divorce Guy. She agreed, was crowned, then immediately placed the crown on Guy's head. She had tricked them. Guy de Lusignan was now king. With Baldwin dead and Guy too weak to stop him, a rogue baron named Reynold broke the truce with Saladin. He attacked a Muslim caravan and slaughtered the merchants. Saladin declared jihad. In July 1187, King Guy marched his army into the waterless plateau of Hattin. He walked straight into the trap Baldwin had avoided for a decade. The Battle of Hattin was not a fight, it was an execution. The dehydrated crusaders were slaughtered. The true cross was captured. King Guy was captured. With the army destroyed, Jerusalem was defenseless. On October 2, 1187, the city surrendered. The kingdom of Jerusalem as Baldwin knew it was gone. It had lasted 88 years. In the end, it wasn't destroyed by the strength of its enemies, but by the weakness of its own leaders who failed to heed the lessons of the dying boy who had once saved them. Baldwin IV had held back the tide with a broken hand. Guy de Lusignan opened the floodgates with a healthy one. Today, nearly 1,000 years later, King Baldwin IV resonates with the modern generation. Why? Because we live in an age of curated perfection, bombarded with images of flawless bodies and filtered lives. Baldwin represents the exact opposite. He is the anti-victim. He had every excuse to give up, to hide, to blame God. But he didn't. He played a terrible hand of cards with absolute mastery. Baldwin IV teaches us that we cannot control what happens to our bodies. We cannot control the time we are born in or the enemies we face. We can only control our response.